Night. 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind didn't howl. It pressed a flat weight against the cabin, forcing its way through every seam, every crack. Inside, there was no wood, no reserve left. This wasn't just scarcity, it was a death sentence. Harlan Hale opened the cast iron stove. The last of the heat tried to escape as the cold rushed in to take its place. What he held wasn't wood, a black brick, rough, pressed from sawdust and pine resin, a thing no one in Crocheted Basin believed could burn for more than an hour. Behind him, in the alcove, Eliza lay huddled under useless blankets. Her breath was broken, too shallow, too weak for a night like this. Harlan set the brick among the dying embers. No flare, no crackle. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, it caught. Low, smoldering. The flame didn't rise. It clung to the brick, holding to itself. Not strong, not fierce, but it didn't go out. The heat didn't surge. It stayed just enough to hold back the encroaching cold. Outside, the other cabins had fallen into darkness. Fires dead, wood gone. No second chances. No one in the valley believed that pressed dust could burn. No one believed he would survive the night. In this cabin, there was no margin for error. The cold was waiting. If this brick failed, it would all be over before morning. And if you're still here, chances are you're waiting to see what happens next. Stay with us, and if this story moved you, show your support with a like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The brick held. For now. But that night had not begun there. It had started weeks earlier before the cold settled in, before the wind found every gap in the boards. Back when there was still time to count what a man had and what he didn't. Harlan Hale and Eliza Hale arrived in Crocheted Basin late in the season. Too late for proper cutting, too late for drying, too late for anything but choosing what to face. The cabin they claimed stood small and unfinished at the edge of the basin. 4 walls up, roof holding, gaps still visible where light passed through in thin lines. There was no stacked cordwood waiting, only a scattered pile of green timber, fresh cut, heavy with moisture, wood that would smoke, wood that would choke a fire before it warmed a room. Harlan stacked what he could, split what he could, measured it without writing anything down. It wasn't enough. Ephraim Cutter, a long-settled homesteader who had buried more than one man lost to winter miscalculation, came to look it over. He didn't speak right away. He walked the perimeter, checked the pile, weighed the wood in his hands. Then he said it plain. A place like this needs 3.5 cords, 4 to be safe. He looked at the green wood again. You don't have time to season it. No argument followed, no correction offered, just a conclusion that did not need repeating. Not enough wood meant one thing in Crocheted Basin. Not discomfort, not hardship, death. Eliza stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, the other against the weight she carried. Final weeks. No room for delay, no room for relocation. Time was no longer something they could use. It had turned, and it was moving against them. There was no panic in the cabin, no raised voices, only a quiet understanding that settled in with the evening cold. They were not preparing for winter. They were already behind it. And in Crocheted Basin, when a man fell behind winter, he did not catch up by cutting faster. He found something else to burn. The next morning, Harlan Hale walked the 3.5 miles to Black Elk Timber Camp, the nearest sawmill operation, cutting through the valley's timberline before the snow closed the roads for good. The yard was active, men moving logs, blades turning, wood falling into measured lengths. But what drew Harlan's attention was not the lumber. It was what the mill left behind. At the far edge of the yard, beyond the stacked beams and cut boards, lay a wide, uneven field of sawdust, piled high in places, flattened in others, spread like pale soil across the ground, waste, shoveled out, pushed aside, forgotten. Harlan stepped onto it. His boots sank slightly, then held. He crouched and ran a hand through it, dry on the surface, finer underneath. Amos Vale, a mill hand who had worked timber lines longer than most men stayed in one place, noticed him there. "No use for that," Amos said, nodding toward the spread. "Too loose. It smothers a fire. Pack's wrong. It'll choke it dead." He wiped his hands on his coat. "And if you try forcing it, you'll get smoke. Tar. Trouble you don't want." Harlan didn't answer. Behind them, another voice cut in. Silas Boone, a local supplier who dealt in cut wood and hauling contracts, stood with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That pile," Silas said, "wouldn't keep a dog warm through dusk." A few men nearby laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Harlan stayed where he was. He didn't argue, didn't correct. He watched how the dust shifted when stepped on, how the top layer broke, but the lower layers held, how weight changed it. Loose above, different below. The wind moved across the yard, lifting the lightest particles, leaving the heavier ones settled. Not all of it behaved the same. Harlan let the dust fall back through his fingers. It looked like waste. It was treated like waste, but it didn't feel like nothing. And for the first time since he had stepped into the basin, a thought began to form, not fully shaped, not yet tested, just enough to stand on for a moment. This was not useless. It did not look like anything a man could trust his life to. But Harlan Hale had spent years in places where nothing looked useful until it was forced to be. The memory did not come back all at once. It never did. It came in parts. Sawdust packed between crates to keep iron tools from shifting on rough ground. Sawdust lining the bottom of supply chests to pull moisture away from metal. Loose when poured, useless when scattered, different when compressed. In the field, materials were never judged by what they were. They were judged by what they did under pressure. He had seen soft things hold shape when forced tight enough, seen waste become structure when it was packed past the point of movement. And pitch pine resin was never just fuel. It sealed, it bound, it held heat where it would otherwise escape. The thought did not arrive as a solution. It aligned. If loose material failed because it shifted, then something that did not shift might not fail the same way. If sawdust was no longer loose, it would no longer behave like dust. Harlan stood, brushing his hands clean. He did not speak to Amos, did not answer Silas, did not explain what had not yet been proven. He walked to the edge of the yard where the piles were driest. Then he began to gather it, not because he knew it would work, but because it had not yet been shown that it couldn't. He carried the sawdust back in sacks. Not enough to matter yet, just enough to begin. Behind the cabin, Harlan Hale set up a crude working space, a split plank for a table, a bent metal pan to heat resin, a hand-cut wooden mold that did not fit cleanly together. There was no design, only trial. He mixed dry sawdust with softened pine pitch, working it by hand until it clumped, pressed it into the mold, forced it down with a short lever that flexed more than it held. The first block came out uneven. It cracked before it cooled. He set it in the stove anyway. It caught fast, too fast, burned uneven, collapsed inward. The flame broke apart and died before it gave back any real heat. The second attempt held its shape better. Too much resin. It flared hard when lit. Hot, bright, quick, then gone. Heat spent in a rush that left nothing behind. The third was packed tighter. Not tight enough. It blackened, smoked, refused to hold a steady burn. Harlan said nothing through any of it. He adjusted by feel, changed pressure, changed mix, changed timing. Inside the cabin, Eliza Hale watched from the doorway for a while before stepping back in. She did not question the work, did not encourage it either. When he came in later, hands darkened with resin and ash, she asked only one thing: "Do you have time for this?" Harlan did not answer right away, because the question was not about the work. It was about the winter, and whether what he was doing was building something, or spending the last days they had left. He did not stop. Not after the cracks, not after the failed burns. Harlan Hale changed the work the way he had learned to change anything that failed under pressure, one variable at a time. He sifted the sawdust, separating the coarse from the fine, kept the smallest particles, let the rest fall aside. He warmed the pine pitch longer, not to thin it, but to make it bind evenly. Then he fixed the press. The short lever was replaced with a longer arm cut from a straight length of scrap timber. It gave him more force, more control, less guesswork in how tight the material packed. 6 parts sawdust, 1 part softened resin. No more, no less. He pressed the mixture down slowly this time, not forcing it all at once, letting the mass settle, tighten, lock into itself. The block came out solid, edges held, no splitting. He set it aside to cool. When it was ready, he placed it into the stove with a small bed of coals beneath. For a moment, it did nothing. Then it caught. No flare, no sudden rise. A low, steady glow built through the surface. The flame held close to the material, not racing away from it. He closed the stove door and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The heat did not spike. It stayed. 30 minutes in, the brick was still burning. Not fast, not bright, but constant. No one stood beside him to see it. No one marked the time. No one confirmed what had changed. Harlan did not speak. He only watched the fire hold its shape, and for the first time since the work began, there was something in front of him that did not fail. Not a solution. Not yet. But a fact. It could burn, and it could last. A thing did not stay hidden long in Crocheted Basin. Not work, not mistakes, and not something that looked like a man trying to burn what others threw away. Word moved before proof ever could. By the time Harlan Hale had stacked a few rows of the pressed bricks along the inside wall of his cabin, men had already begun to talk. At Mercer's Crossing, where supplies changed hands and news carried faster than wagons, the story was told plain and short. He's burning sawdust. That was enough. Silas Boone stood with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes, took it further. Not burning it, Silas said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, wasting what little time he's got left, trying to make it act like wood. A few men shook their heads, some laughed. He'll freeze before the real cold even settles, Silas added. You don't outthink winter by setting fire to dust, no one argued. Later, near the edge of Harlan's claim, Ephraim Cutter came by again. He did not carry the same tone as Silas. No mockery, no raised voice. He looked at the stacked bricks, at the stove, at the unfinished lines in the cabin walls. Then he said what needed saying. Don't put your wife's life on something no one's proven. It was not an insult. It was a warning built from years of watching men trust the wrong thing at the wrong time. Harlan stood there, listening. He did not defend the work, did not explain the ratios, did not point to the burn times he had already seen. There was nothing yet that could stand outside his own cabin and hold. So he let the words pass. That evening, he went back to the press, measured again, packed again, set each brick in place along the wall. The laughter carried less weight than the cold, and the cold was already on its way. Harlan did not need to be certain he was right, only certain that doing nothing would be worse. So he kept working, even knowing they might be right. He kept working, because stopping would not solve the count, and the count was already against him. 9 days. That was what remained before the first hard storm was expected to close the basin. After that, the road to Black Elk Timber Camp would disappear under drift and ice. What was not inside the cabin by then would not be reached again. Harlan Hale moved before daylight and returned after it was gone. 3.5 miles each way, sacks over his shoulder, sawdust packed tight to carry more weight per trip, fine dust, not coarse, chosen, not gathered at random. Back at the cabin, the work did not slow. Resin heated in a shallow pan until it softened but did not thin. Sawdust measured by feel, 6 parts to 1. He pressed each block with the long lever, slow pressure, letting the mass settle before forcing it further, releasing only when it held its shape on its own. Hands darkened, sleeves stiff with pitch, breath steady, but shorter each day. Inside, Eliza Hale moved less. She stayed closer to the alcove, sat more than she stood. The weight she carried no longer shifted easily. Sleep came in short stretches. Waking came faster. Time did not pass. It narrowed. The line of bricks along the walls began to grow, row after row, stacked tight, set where they could be reached without waste. Harlan kept count without marking it down. By the end of the 9th day, the number stood at 2,460. Enough to fill the space, not enough to trust. He stood in the doorway that evening and looked at what he had built. Not wood, not fuel anyone in the basin would have chosen. A system made from what others left behind. The wind had already begun to shift. The cold was close now. And for the first time since he started, the question no longer sat at the edge of his thinking. It stood in front of him. Not whether it would work, but whether it would last. And if it didn't, there would be nothing left to try. And then the cold arrived to measure it. It did not come all at once. It settled in stages. The first drop took the basin to 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Manageable, by the standards of men who had seen worse. By nightfall, it slid further past 25 degrees Fahrenheit, then down to 31 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. Cold enough to test every bad decision. Harlan Hale stopped using the green wood. He switched to the bricks. The first few did not take easily. He had to build a small bed of coals beneath them. A little wood, just enough to start the burn. Without that, the bricks resisted, slow to catch, unwilling to flare. But once they held, they held. The fire did not climb high, did not surge and fall. It stayed close, steady, contained. No thick smoke pushed back into the room. No choking draft from the flue. Inside the cabin, the difference was not immediate comfort. It was resistance. The temperature did not rise much, but it stopped falling the way it had before. Eliza Hale noticed it first. She shifted under the blankets and waited, measured the air the way someone does when they no longer trust it. "It's not warmer," she said after a while. Harlan didn't answer. She looked toward the stove again. "It's just not leaving." That same afternoon, Ruth Cutter, Ephraim Cutter's wife, and a woman who had spent enough winters watching small changes decide who lived and who didn't, stepped inside. She did not ask what he was burning, did not look for explanation. She moved closer to the stove and held her hand out, palm open to the heat. Waited. Long enough to feel the pattern, not just the warmth. Then she lowered her hand. "It holds," she said, not louder than it needed to be, not offered as approval, just a statement of fact. Outside, the basin stayed locked under cold that did not ease. Inside, the fire did not fail. It did not win anything yet, but it did something else. It held the line, and for the first time, there was more than one person who had seen it happen. The line held. For a few days, that was enough. Then something else began to show, not in the fire, in what the fire left behind. Harlan Hale moved through the cabin late one evening, checking the stacks he had built along the walls. Rows of unused bricks, pressed tight and set where they could be reached without waste. He placed a hand against one. It was warm, not from direct flame, not from contact with the stove, from the room itself. He moved to another stack, lower along the wall, then to the edge of the alcove where Eliza slept. The bricks there held more heat. He didn't say anything at first. He waited. That night, the temperature outside dropped again, not as deep as before, but enough to test whether anything inside had changed. Eliza shifted under the blankets, then settled. Less movement, less tightening against the cold. She slept longer between waking. By morning, the pattern was clear. The cabin wasn't warmer, but the cold moved slower through it. Harlan began to change the layout. He pulled bricks from the outer wall and set them tighter around the alcove, built a low barrier where heat could gather and hold, stacked them where the warmth from the stove would reach and stay. Not fuel, placement. Later that day, Ruth Cutter returned. She stepped inside, paused, and watched him move the stacks. No questions, only observation. When he finished, she walked to the alcove and placed her hand against the nearest row, held it there, then looked back at him. "You're not just burning them," she said. Harlan didn't answer. Ruth nodded once, as if confirming something she had already seen forming. "You're holding the heat in them." The fire in the stove had not changed, but the room had, and what Harlan had built was no longer just a way to keep something burning. It was becoming a way to keep something from leaving. He didn't have more fuel. He had more control, and for the first time, the work began to look less like survival by chance and more like a system. The system held, until it didn't. The second drop came without warning. The wind shifted first, not stronger, just different. It cut lower across the basin, slipped along the ground, and found the chimney from a new angle. The draft inside the stove changed. Not enough to notice at once, enough to matter. By nightfall, the temperature had already fallen past 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Then deeper, 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 degrees Fahrenheit, and still dropping. The burn rate climbed with it. 40 bricks a day became 45, then 50. Harlan Hale did not need to write it down. He could see it in the stacks, in the way the rows thinned faster than they should. Then the problems came together. A batch from 2 days prior, set aside near the door, had taken on moisture. The edges felt right. The core did not. He fed them into the stove anyway. They caught poorly. Not enough heat, not enough hold. At the same time, the wind turned again. The draft pulled wrong. The flame flattened, struggled to rise. The heat that had been holding inside the stove began to break apart. The room felt it immediately, not slowly. Fast, cold moved back in. Eliza Hale sat up in the alcove, one hand pressed low against her side. Her breathing changed first. Then the tension followed, a tightening that did not belong to the cold alone. She tried to steady it. It didn't steady. The stove dropped another degree. The glow inside weakened. Harlan stood there, watching the system fail in real time. Not all at once, piece by piece. The numbers were still in his head. How many bricks remained? How many days the cold could hold? What it would cost to burn harder now? He had built the system to last, to stretch, to survive the length of the winter. But this was not the average. This was the break. He had two choices. Hold the rate. Let the fire stay controlled. Let the fuel last longer, and risk losing the room before morning. Or push it. Feed the stove faster. Stack heat harder. Spend what he could not replace. And get through the night. Only the night. Harlan did not speak. He opened the stove. Cold air pulled in hard. The flame bent low, close to dying. He reached for the stack. One brick, then another, then another. He did not wait for them to settle before adding more. The fire responded. Not clean, not steady, but stronger. The heat rose just enough to push back. Eliza's breathing slowed. Not steady, not safe, but not breaking. The cost showed up fast. The stack along the wall dropped lower with every hour. What should have lasted 3 days was being burned in less than 2. Harlan watched the rows thin out. He didn't slow down, because the stove was already losing ground. The heat had to stay ahead of the cold, and the only way to do that was to feed it more than the system was built to handle. He wasn't stretching the fuel anymore. He was spending it, faster than he could afford. And still, it might not be enough. The fire held through the night. At a cost, by morning, the stacks along the wall had dropped enough for the loss to be seen without counting. What had been margin was now risk. The cold did not ease. It settled, and with it came word. A cabin 2 claims over closer to the low ground where the wind cut hardest had run out of wood. Not low, gone. There were children inside, young enough that the cold did not need long to take hold. No one brought that news with urgency. In Crocheted Basin, urgency did not change outcomes once the numbers were already wrong. It was said plainly, they're out. Harlan Hale stood in the doorway and looked across the stretch of land between the cabins. Snow lay flat, unbroken. No smoke rose from that direction. He did not ask how much they had left. He already knew the answer. Inside his own cabin, the remaining stacks stood in ordered rows, reduced, not empty, but no longer certain. He could keep every brick, stretch the burn, hold the system tight, give himself the best possible chance of lasting through what remained of the cold. Or he could divide it, reduce his own margin, add to theirs. There was no version of the count where both came out safe. Harlan turned back inside. He did not explain the numbers to Eliza, did not speak the calculation out loud. He began to move the bricks. Not all of them. Not enough to make the choice easy. 180. He stacked them into a rough crate, lifted it, carried it out. The distance was not far. The cold made it longer. When he reached the other cabin, the door opened before he knocked. No words were offered. None were needed. Harlan set the crate down. The man inside looked at it, then at Harlan. Understanding came without question. Harlan did not explain how to use them, did not justify the risk, did not wait for thanks. He turned and walked back the way he came. Behind him, the first brick was already being placed into a stove that had gone cold. Inside his own cabin, the stacks were smaller, the system thinner, and for the first time, the outcome was no longer only his to lose. He did not know if what he had done would save them, or if it had moved him one step closer to failing. He only knew one thing. The cold did not care how a man made his choices, only whether they held. By morning, the basin had taken its measure. The night of 52 degrees Fahrenheit had passed. Not quietly, not without cost, but not with the outcome most had expected. The cabin 2 claims over where there had been no wood left still showed smoke. Thin, steady. Word moved faster this time. Not rumor, not talk, result. They made it through. That was enough to draw attention where doubt had held before. Silas Boone did not go to Harlan's cabin. He went to theirs. The door opened to a room that should have been cold. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't failing. The stove held a low, steady burn, not with split logs, with blocks, dark, packed, feeding the fire in the same controlled way Harlan's had. A child sat near the wall, wrapped in blankets, breathing slow and even, alive. No one explained anything. No one needed to. Silas stepped closer to the stove and looked inside, watched how the material burned, how it didn't flare, didn't collapse, how it held. He said nothing. Behind him, Ruth Cutter stood near the doorway. She had seen this pattern already, felt it before others named it. She didn't point, didn't argue. She only said what was already in front of him. They didn't have wood. Silas didn't answer, because there was nothing left to argue, no theory to hold on to, no explanation that could undo what was sitting in front of him. A stove that should have gone cold, a room that had not, a family that should have been lost, still there. The cold had done its work, and the result had chosen a side. Silas stood there a moment longer, then stepped back, not convinced by words, but stripped of the right to doubt what he had just seen. Silas left that cabin without a word. He did not go back to his own. He walked the long way across the basin. By midday, he had already passed the story along not as talk, but as fact, and by the time the sun reached its highest point, another man had made a different decision. Ephraim Cutter did not arrive empty-handed. He came to Harlan Hale's cabin with a short-handled shovel, a rough wooden mold cut from scrap, and a sack slung over his shoulder filled with sawdust taken from the same piles Harlan had once stood over alone. He did not stop at the doorway. He stepped inside, set the tools down, and looked once at the stove. Not to test it, to confirm what had already been decided. He turned to Harlan. There was no caution in his voice now, no measured warning, only direction. "Show me how you pack it." Harlan did not answer. He moved to the work table, measured the sawdust, fine, not coarse, warmed the resin just enough to bind, not run, set the ratio without speaking it, 6-to-1. He placed the mixture into the mold and brought the long lever down, slow pressure, held at the bottom, released only when the shape could stand on its own. Ephraim watched once, then stepped forward and took the place without being asked. His hands worked differently, more force at first, then less. He adjusted, pressed again. The second block came out cleaner. He set it aside with the same care Harlan had used from the beginning. No questions followed, no need for proof. The stove behind them already held that. A man who had lived through winters by counting cords, by measuring wood, by trusting only what had been proven over years, was now learning something new. Not by being told, by doing. The old rule had not been argued away. It had been replaced. And for the first time, the system Harlan had built was no longer his alone to carry. It had moved from one man's work to something others would use to live. What moved through Ephraim did not stop with him. In Crocheted Basin, men did not wait for instruction when survival had already changed direction. They watched. Then they tried. By the next 2 days, more cabins had begun to burn something that had never been counted as fuel. Not wood, not coal, compressed dust. At Black Elk Timber Camp, the piles at the far edge of the yard were no longer ignored. Men who had once shoveled sawdust aside began to gather it differently, not as waste, as supply. Dry sections were separated, covered, held back. No one called it valuable, not out loud, but no one threw it away anymore. Near the cabins, the pattern repeated. A man would stand near Harlan Hale's wall, watching how the bricks were stacked, how they sat close to the alcove, how the stove was fed without rush. Then he would leave, and do the same at his own place. No announcements, no claims, just quiet adoption. By the time Silas Boone returned, the laughter was already gone. He did not come with others, did not carry the same stance. He stopped outside the cabin first, looked at the stacks through the open doorway, at the rows along the wall, at the steady burn inside the stove. Then he stepped in. No smile, no remark, only a question that had no edge left in it. How do you make it hold? Harlan did not answer with words. He moved to the table, measured, packed, pressed. Silas watched, the same way Harlan had once stood in the sawdust yard, watching what others dismissed. There was no apology spoken, none needed. Because in that room, and in others across the basin, the change had already taken place. What had been mocked had become necessary. What had been waste had become fuel. And the sound that once filled the space, laughter, had been replaced by something else. Silence, not empty, but full of men learning how to survive the same way. Silence settled over the basin again. Not the same silence as before. This one came after something had already been decided. By the morning of December 26, the cold began to break. Not quickly, but enough. The edge came off the wind first. Then the air followed, rising just enough to be measured in small differences. A hinge unsticking, a door opening without force, breath no longer cutting as sharply in the lungs. The burn rate dropped with it. Where the stove had taken 50 bricks a day, it now held steady at less, 40. Then lower. The system no longer fought to keep up. It carried. Inside the cabin, the walls held what they had been given. Heat did not escape the way it once had. It stayed where it was placed, moved slower, lasted longer. In the alcove, Eliza Hale rested without the same tension in her breathing. The nights did not pass easily, but they passed. And then, in the quiet stretch that followed the breaking cold, the child came. No announcement marked it. No one gathered. There was no space in Crocheted Basin for celebration that winter had not already taken from someone else. Only a small shift. One more person breathing in a room that had held. Harlan Hale did not stand outside to measure what he had done. He did not speak of the bricks, did not count what remained. He fed the stove the same way he had from the beginning. Measured, controlled, without waste. Outside, the sawdust piles at Black Elk were no longer pushed aside. Inside the basin, men stacked their fuel differently, not by cord, by form, by what it did, not what it was. The cold had come. It had pressed every wall, every choice, every assumption, and it had taken what it was owed. But it had not taken that cabin, not the woman inside, not the child, not the system that had held when others failed. In Crocheted Basin, they did not speak about innovation. They did not name what had changed. They only adjusted what they asked. No longer how much wood a man had stacked for winter, but something quieter, something harder, what he knew how to burn.